Okay, this is the third video. Welcome to the third video. In this video, we'll be talking about the leap itself, the leap to immortality that they made. If you have not yet, please watch the other videos first, as you will get a bit more of a background. Starting here might get some things out of context. So, the leap, as we already have talked about, the corporation or the company was dealing with longevity. They had a number of different areas in which they had specialists: genetics, medicine, technology, basically well-rounded stuff, everything they need to push things forward, because their life, they want to prolong life. That's what the company's about. They get a lot of money from it. So, in trying to make things truly immortal, not just like putting yourself in a robot, but truly immortal and true life that you want to live. One of the problems with biology is that there's so many things that can bring it down. Even if you're able to fix, problems with telomere shortening, there's still problems. Bacteria and viruses always find ways to successfully attack their host. I mean, add to the mix the chemicals, radiation, and other things that come along with modern life that have effects. Maybe the effect over 20, 30, 40 years is one thing, but when your effect over 200, 300, 400, 1,000 years, keeping the biology of one organism going reliably like that, it's a hard thing. And so, even if it's possible, there's still a lot of other things that could bring it to an end. Even if you have a self-sustaining thing still. There's viruses that could bring you to an end either way. But they needed to solve it. They need to solve a real problem where they're not going to have to worry that they're going to be there. And they're going to keep living. So, one of the solutions that ultimately came about, maybe not right at first, but ultimately came about, is a sealed environment. Take only what you want with you. Control the environment down to the microbe level. Don't even have viruses you don't want. Whether it's trees or plants, insects, anything like that. In the environment you have, only the things you choose to have are in it. Nothing else. While that sounds impossible now, keep my eye skipping around a bit. Ultimately, eventually, that's exactly what they got. They're able to control down to everything. Makes for less worry, makes for less unpredictability. So in the short term, though, this was very much about how to do it now, because the clock was ticking. Let's face it. All the scientists there were getting older as well, and without a real solution on how not to die, the focus was a bit more on how to make at least the first part of the leap, and maybe figuring out everything else could wait until they at least got a couple hundred more years for everybody to keep going. And so the plan was basically to switch bodies. And I know that sounds weird, but there came a point where they kept hitting walls everywhere they went. And the natural genetics and natural things that they were given, there was only so much that they were ultimately able to do with. And to transfer the consciousness not just into a robot, but into a body that they created from the biology, but somewhat, just more advanced. It's biology 2. Or 1.2 or 1.5. I don't know. You could say biology 2.0. Nothing I'm going to give you is going to be extremely accurate here. There's a lot of scientific details that are just going to get lost. But they needed better or more improved bodies. They just did. And so either way, they were going to die. There was no way around that. No question. Given enough time, the technology they have, they were going to die. Their bodies were going to stop. ticking. And so, since that was an inevitability either way, the idea of switching your consciousness into not just a robot, but an actual better, more improved body based on your genetics, it was pretty attractive, actually. And so that's what they started to work on. Now, this project took a little more time than they would like. The years went on. All total until this project was done, it took about 100 years. 100 of our years, their years were pretty much the same. And so, along this, they've dropped hints about this. If you've looked at different places, they've dropped hints about it. But they had to do what they had to do. They had to take some technology from rival companies through whatever means they could. They had to do a lot of stuff, a lot of work, a lot of patience, a lot of long hours. And as it was going on, many of the scientists were getting too old. They weren't going to see the end of it. So as an interim fix, as the scientists were getting older, they digitized themselves into the interim robots that I told you about, the ones that you keep a copy of your memories, you keep a pretty advanced copy of how your information processing works in your mind, but they also kept copies of their biology, or their DNA, of everything that it makes them. I mean, this isn't just like freezing your head. I mean, you freeze your head, I mean, you're gone. I mean, there's no bringing that back. But the amount of processing they did was extreme. They got exactly how, each neuron was working in their mind. They did. It was really extensive, and so they had no choice, but that's all they had. And so they put the scientists that were dying anyway into that format, to where they at least were still conscious in some manner, and their biology was 100% saved. Everything was saved down to the minute level, for those that wouldn't make it otherwise. So they kept going, and they made it. They finally made it along the same time as they figured out how to move consciousness and move the mind. I mean, because looking into the brain, you'd say, I know that sounds really, really, really scary. You'd never want to do that. And even if you're on your deathbed, you'd be tempted not to. But I mean, look into the detail of it. Each individual synapse, each individual neuron. I mean, it's made out of stuff, and the stuff that's making up all this, I mean, it's the same as the stuff that makes anyone else's mind. The material of it, it's just material. It's the structure. It's the organization. It's how it works that gives you your individuality. So duplicating the structure, copying the structure of it into different material, well, it's still as much the same material, but I mean, copying the structure into newer, better material that's physically more robust, it does keep the essence of who you are. And there's little tricks they had to keep doing that. So, yeah, they copied the mind down to the very last little bit. And that's how the first thing went. And so, was it the same person? Was it not? Well, they feel it was. Because of the tricks that they've learned, they feel it was. And either way, they didn't have any other choice. That's the only way that they were going to keep going anyway, because the bodies they had were the ones that nature gave them, not the ones that they gave themselves. Along the same time, though, is, like I said, it took around 100 years for that. Once they thought they could get it, it took 100 years afterwards for that project to finally wrap up and make the first of the people successfully leap into the new bodies. But along the same time, they also figured out how to hide. Because if you remember back to their society, I told you it was not a pleasant society. It was violent, and they were in danger. And with something like this, I mean, you just imagine a sinking ship, for example. If you have a sinking ship and there's one lifeboat, there's only so many people that can get on that lifeboat. People will fight, kick, and scream and kill in order to get there. Especially in a violent world. Not everyone's just going to be the noble person and stand off to the side and say, here you go, women and children, you go first. There are people that are going to kill and knock anybody out of their way. And they knew that this would be the case if this got let out. They kept the whole thing extremely secret. Extremely, extremely secret. And they didn't have that many that they could do like that. I mean, you're talking even then with the technology that they had, which was considerably more advanced than ours. Even then, it was sort of like making an Apollo program for every single individual you were doing. It was extremely resource intensive. They had money. They're a longevity company. The people pay them, tons of things. And they had very wealthy donors. But even at that, this was something that they were not going to have a lot of. This is not something that's available to the general public. There was no physical possible way to scientifically make that happen at that point. It was too advanced at that time. And so they needed to learn to hide. At first, they just got a little area in which they hid the scientists that were, basically died and put into the interim digitized format, so that they were sort of out of the limelight. People didn't know what was going on. But they needed a more permanent solution. They didn't just want another little area in the same world. They wanted to disappear. And that was a very interesting solution that they found. And one that, if this here has, so to this point, hasn't blown your mind, how they hid certainly is going to sound completely unrealistic. But it happened. Okay, so where they found a place to hide was basically another dimension. Now, I understand this sounds like science fiction. It's like way unrealistic. I mean, how can you have another dimension on top of what we already have? And we already have up, down, we have depth. But really, what is the other dimension? How does it get there? I mean, and exactly what is it talking about? Like, how do you just switch between them? Well, they found that out. And what I'm going to tell you about them, you have to be very careful with. Please don't share this. If our scientists found out really about how to use them, then it would be inconvenient. See, the thing is, they don't want to be found. And our scientists, when they're working on things somewhat similar to this, are fed misinformation. They're intentionally fed disinformation. They play around with their data. They do that all the time. You really think that an alien ship is going to crash in Roswell just because, they know how to travel light years like that, but some sort of primitive, death beam or something, whatever it is supposed to just bring them down? No. There's nothing that we have that wasn't fully intended that we have. I mean, all of our science has been drip fed to us in one subtle way or another. The science that we know is, in part, the honest people really try to figure it out. You do it in labs, you can see it, you create it yourself. But there's been a lot of interference behind the scenes that no one realizes. And so back then they didn't have that. There was nobody that was interfering with their test results. There was no one behind the scenes pulling strings to either make them fail or make them succeed. And so they found out the secret of how it works. I'm going to tell you the basics of it. It's not going to jive with anything that mainstream science is going to do. Not because I'm a nut, but just because they don't want this solution to be found. This is going to be one of the most closely guarded, protected secrets that the other side has, and it's going to stay that way. And if you don't think they're going to be able to keep staying it, even with me telling you the basics of how it's working, then you got another thing coming. They're very good at keeping stuff from developing if they really, really don't want it. So, in a brief nutshell, and a lot of the scientifics behind how this works hasn't even been dreamed up yet, is you have to go down to the smallest level of below the atomic level, to the smallest particles. And you could see they actually go in and out of existence. It just seems like they vanish and they're just gone, and then they just reappear. Things just pop in and out of existence just randomly, seemingly. And that is weird. You could see things can pop up in different areas and then pop right back. It can seem like you can have one particle in two places at once, or even things with subtle time delays or time things going on with it. But getting down to it is they're not disappearing. Those particles are not gone. They're just in different phase. As many, many, many things do, they have a cycle that they go through. Call it a wave. I mean, waves are... Light has wave functions that it has. Ocean waves, there's sound waves, there's all sorts of types of things that have periods that repeat, what we call waves. Now, if for those of you that don't know too much about waves, an ocean wave, I believe you'd call it a longitudinal wave. It goes up and down, like you're used to. Now, a sound wave is a compression wave. Sound does not go up and down like an ocean wave. It doesn't look like that. It's a compression wave. It compresses and then decompresses. If you look at a slinky, if you push a slinky back and forth, you can see a compression wave going through the slinky. Not like pulling it up and down like an ocean wave, but actually pushing and pulling the slinky. There's elements where it's more closely bunched together and other parts where it's further apart, and it travels down the length of the slinky. And that's much what sound does. It's a compression wave. Now, at the lowest level, everything goes out the window. Mass, the idea of how everything interacts, it just goes out the window. It's so small and it's so weird that it's going to take a long time to really, truly understand, but think of it as a wave or a period that keeps repeating over and over again. And these different, call them energy levels or energy types, different points in the wave. The reason why that the small particles disappear is that they're at a different point on the wave than other particles around them. And one of the peculiarities of these particles is that they don't interact with other particles around them that are not on the same part of the same frequency. So particles of the same frequency, the same part of the wave, will interact with each other. Particles that are on different parts of the wave just don't interact. They can fly right by each other and then they don't even care. And so this ultimately is what causes dimensions. Naturally, you have you have certain parts of the wave or certain frequencies that are naturally stable and naturally will have the particles group up together and do things like create atoms, create molecules, create worlds. And so what a dimension is it's not something that you just ramp up power and then blow a hole into other dimensions with demons coming out. That's that's fantasy. Granted, it's a fantasy that some people have seen and firsthand, but make no mistake about it, whether you've seen it and seen the test results and science behind it or not, it is fantasy and you are being had. And rightfully so. You should deserve to be had, because you shouldn't be playing with things like that. But in terms of this discussion, you need to understand it, because it's fundamental to how our whole society works. You can't understand the things that I need to tell you unless you understand this, because so many things are based off of the decisions they made then. And so, yeah, naturally speaking, they found that there were more than one, call it dimension, more than one frequency that those particles naturally stopped at. And another thing they found is that matter itself is disappearing and reappearing over and over again really, really fast. It's not just one particle, but every particle does it. And the reason why it looks like they're all together and it's just one that's disappearing is because of another effect that it has. At the lowest, smallest level, for some reason, things tend to group together in time, in phase with one another. And who knows why that happens. I know they know the reasons for it, but I really flat out don't. But the reason why you see only one thing disappearing is it's not just the one thing disappearing. Everything's disappearing, but it's disappearing, it's going in and out of the frequency together. It's moving, by and large, at the same time, with some things here and there not quite in sync with everything else. But no, everything is disappearing and it's reappearing. So we only actually exist for a fraction of the time that we think that we exist. Like a movie. You just don't notice it because it's really, really fast and, for the most part, synced up together. And so that's really what the dimensions are. It's, you have the same matter, the same mass, the same things, the same particles on one frequency at one energy point and at another frequency at another energy point. And so naturally, I don't know how many dimensions there are naturally speaking, but my guess is that I know it's at least 2. I think that it's going to be more than that, probably, 3, 4. I really don't know. They didn't tell me how many natural dimensions there are. It's certainly not infinite. I can tell you that for a fact right now. I can tell you that for an absolute fact. It is absolutely not infinite. We do not have infinite numbers of dimensions. It's just fantasy that you can have every single action is going to be different somewhere. You just have to travel to the right dimension or travel to the right spot or travel light years away into distant galaxies, and you're going to find someone that's exactly like you that just happened to make a different choice. No, that's fantasy. Yeah, people have been told that, but those dimensions that they're talking about are the simulated computer dimensions that are basically just playing with people's mind. It's not playing with your mind. It's just a computer simulation of what would have happened had you been doing these things. But that's really the extent of it. There is no such thing as infinite dimensions. I have no idea how many there are. There could be 10, 12, 20, but I know there's at least 2. Probably, 3, 4, but really I don't know. Or the point of the matter is they found it. And about the same time as they figured out how to make the leap into different, better designed bodies, they also figured out how to make a leap into a different natural dimension than the one that they were on. This was the ultimate hiding spot. Now, if you remember about, it's the particles themselves, they don't multiply and they don't, shrink by a certain number. They stay, it's the same particle is the same particle is the same particle. So you don't have more particles or less particles. The mass stays the same. So if you have another dimension of Earth, you're not going to have one that's like 3 times the size of Earth, and another one that's just a small little rock that can't do anything. It's going to be the same size, exactly the same mass. And what's more, while there is an effect where things can be a little different here and there, um, there's a lot of similarities because it's the same particles going in and out of phase, basically. I mean, there is a tendency to have much the same makeup as it does here. Generally the same levels of hydrogen, helium, other elements. Now, one of the peculiarities at the really small level is that, as you can have seen in some preliminary test results we've had here, those little particle things can move really quickly, and they remember their position somehow, some way, and I don't know how. I know they know how, but that's just one of the peculiarities they have. It's the particle in this part of its phase will be here in this physical spot, but then when it goes into its other frequency, other part of its existence, the other frequency it has, it can actually be physically in another location. Why? Who knows? But that's one of the hallmarks about it. So while there are similarities and there are things that go from dimension to dimension, effects that make it very similar, there are also a lot of differences. So you're not going to have the same exact person in every single dimension. It's, in fact, like I said, they had humanity involved first by hundreds of thousands of years at least. And so this is the question is, where did they come from? Their answer is they came from here. And my answer is no, they didn't. Because they came from Earth, not just not this dimension. They were in a different dimension. Their natural dimension that occurred naturally, that they grew up on, was here. It was the same size, same year, same rotation, same everything, basically, because it was a different dimension of this place. And because the elements were so similar, you could see why they grew up to be so similar. It's, physically speaking, it's because they had a ridiculously similar environment that they were growing up in, that their species were evolving in. And it just so happened that these ridiculously similar environments created much the same type of people. But going on with it, they figured out how to shift into another dimension. It was incredibly complex, and it was pretty much just a one and done type of thing at first. So they made the bodies in the new dimension. They made them good. They made it new, and they started transferring people, and that was the leap. This is the leap. The leap happened. They moved into the new bodies, and they moved into the new dimension. And I believe this was, at the time, another one of the natural dimensions, because they didn't know how to make the other ones yet. And I don't believe it was here, so I would imagine that it's probably going to be at least a third dimension that would have existed. Although I really don't know the specifics of it. But yeah, they moved into another dimension, and they moved into the new bodies. And the total number of, over the time that the project was going on, because at first it was really, really, really slow, really hard to do. It was only the oldest of them, the sickest of them, the ones that didn't have a choice. They were the ones that went first. Because you're going to move into a new body, that's going to be scary for anybody. But something happened along with those first ones. They were ecstatic. They felt young again. They were young again. Their youth had returned. They were in prime physical form into bodies that were new and better than they've ever had before. And they knew that if they did it once, they could do it again. That is immortality right there that they knew they had. They could do it again. And with the new bodies that they had, if they had ever, needed to, it wasn't going to be for a very, very long time until they had to do. They would have had to do it again. But either way, they knew they'd made it. And because of the initial successes with the first, then that made it more comfortable for the others as they were getting ready. Some brave ones just wanted to be first and boom, boom, get right in it. And others, drag their feet a little bit until there really wasn't any other choice, and then they made the leap too. But all of them ultimately, well, at least a lot of them ultimately just chose to do it. Now, the total number for everybody in the whole length of the project was somewhere around 500, keeping in mind that it was primarily only the scientists themselves that did that. They didn't open the doors for everybody else. They couldn't. It would have been a floodgate. It would have been like people murdering to try to get into the life raft. They had to keep it very secret. Now, there were some close friends and family members that got invited too. And I'm not sure, but I think it's possible some of the, best donors could have made it too. But primarily it's scientists and a couple other hangers on that would have gone too. I mean, of course they took their wife, and if they had any kids. I mean, but it was really hard. Like I said, it was really, really hard at first. As they went on a little bit further towards, in the middle and towards the end, it got easier and easier, but it was still really hard to do. And so there they are. They were in a new dimension, in new bodies, and they were ecstatic. They were ecstatic because all their hopes and all their fears, their fears of, oh, I'm not going to be the same person, or I'm just going to die and this is going to be like a copy, or, the fears of, what next? I mean, it was all gone. They had made a transition. They felt deeply down that they were the same individuals. They had the same experiences. They had the same everything. They felt like $1,000,000. They felt like they could keep doing this forever. They felt like they could go on forever, and that they'd finally won. And so, yeah, they partied. They transcended the grave for the first time in existence that they had known anyone do. And it was a small group, but keeping in mind that they're biological beings, the new bodies they created were capable of having kids. And so you don't have to just have an end right there with the scientists and then try to get a couple people from, you don't need anybody else. You can have kids. And so they did. They started a new society right then and there, with all the hopes and all the dreams and all the whole universe of possibilities right there. And it was an amazing time. An absolutely amazing, wonderful time where people were just so wonderfully ecstatic about the possibilities of everything. However, as things go, it doesn't just take the technology to know how to live forever, medically speaking, to be able to do it. A very, very, very long lifespan has its problems. I mean, just think about the psychology of it all. I mean, 100 years can be so long for some people to live, yeah, but imagine the psychology of what it would take to live 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 3,000, 4, 5, 10, 20. I mean, the same being, the same thoughts, the same everything, living for extended periods of time. There's other questions that come up. There's some very good, interesting things happen. And there's the whole thing about what effects, like I said, what effects different things have. Like, you wouldn't want viruses to be there, or you wouldn't want... I mean, of course, this was their first go. I very much doubt they had the environment scrubbed right then. I mean, they just didn't know how to yet. But things like alcohol. You take alcohol. They liked it. They had it. And they tried to make it work. And it posed problems over the long run. You have alcohol over the course of 20, 40, 80, 100 years. I mean, really, its effects, it has some bad effects, of course, but, they can be managed. But over the very, very long haul, it's not just alcohol. It's talking about drugs, digital drugs. You take digital drugs that make you feel the same way, but there's no physical effects afterwards. I mean, There's a lot of crazy, complicated, ingenious things that they tried to make things like that work. But it's not just the drugs, not just the alcohol, not just the psychology of the thing, but a number of forces went into play that they didn't think about that caused big problems. And so that's going to be the next video, is what type of problems that extreme long lifespan held. They'd made the leap. They were really ecstatic, but they didn't know what they got into. They just did it because they could do it, and it was all they could do to even make the first leap. They didn't want to die. And so they made the leap. What next? Next video is the what next.